morning. Thank you, David. My name is Dan Burgess, and I'm the director of the Governor's Energy Office and co-chair of the Energy Working Group. I'll let Ken introduce himself.
Sure, Ken Colburn here, but in front of the mountains, and I'm a former environmental regulator who for the last 10 years has been working with public utility commissions across the country with the Regulatory Assistance Project and assisting them in implementing clean energy opportunities. I retired in March from the Regulatory Assistance Project, which is good because that has given me more time to work on the Maine Climate Council work. Thanks, Dan.
Thank you, Ken, and we appreciate the timing of your retirement as you jumped into this full time and you're able to work on this. So the Energy Working Group is going last today, I think, because there is so much overlap and coordination that is needed with the buildings group and the transportation group. And I think you'll hear similar themes and similar objectives. The mission of our group was to develop, analyze, and recommend strategies to the Climate Council to mitigate emissions from and adapt to the impacts of climate change in Maine's energy sector, specifically electricity generation and delivery, as well as thermal supply and delivery. And so what we're going to talk through today is, and think about is, as the electricity sector is undergoing really, and the energy sector is undergoing a transformation, and as Maine considers our energy future, what policies are needed to ensure that we're meeting changing or growing demand, embracing new technologies and ways of thinking, and the like. So before we jump into the recommendations, we thought it was important to give just a very brief overview for those of you that are not on the Energy Working Group or don't think about energy issues every day. Maine is part of a regional electricity grid managed by ISO New England, a regional system operator. And this chart before you shows the generation by fuel source across the region. Just a couple important trends to think about as we think about our energy future. Maine has a cleaner generation resource than this, but because we're part of a regional grid, it's important to highlight. Over on the left is the year 2000, and over to the right is 2019. And you can really see a transformation in the region away from coal and oil electricity generation over the last 20 years, and an increase in reliance on natural gas generation, as well as a few others. Many reasons for that. The regional greenhouse gas initiative that we're a part of, the age of some of those coal and oil, more traditional older plants, and then market dynamics with advent of fracking. I thought it was important to give this background before jumping into our strategies and recommendations. Also important to note here, as Michael talked about, is that, as we think about our home heating sectors, that Maine is reliant on fuel oil, with 60% of our home heating coming from fuel oil, 11% from propane, and you can see the other categories there. And if you look next, you'll see that Maine is actually the most heating oil dependent state in the country. We are that green triangle on the top right, and the other orange boxes are the other New England states. And so there's clearly an opportunity to think about our home heating system using lower carbon fuels, as Michael talked about and Kathleen talked about, and we'll have a little bit more on that. It's also important to highlight that Maine has made significant progress over the last year and a half. And on the left-hand side, you can see that Maine has passed and has one of the most ambitious renewable portfolio standards in the country. A renewable portfolio standard is a requirement that a certain percentage of our electricity come from renewable resources. After 2017, Maine's renewable portfolio standard was at 40%. Last legislative session, a bill was passed to increase that to 80% by 2030 and a goal of 100% by 2050. So Maine is already on a pathway to embrace and achieve an 80% of our electricity coming from renewable resources over the next 10 years. And if you look at that chart on the bottom left, that is the most ambitious in New England. On the right, you can also see that we are, as a result of legislation and programming, seeing really significant growth in distributed generation. So that's projects as defined right now as under 5 megawatts. And currently there are about 65 megawatts, probably more like 80 once you count it, but there are over 2,000 megawatts of proposed projects in the pipeline. And not all those will come online over the next few years, but there's a significant amount of project development happening in the distributed generation space. So we wanted to make sure to give that context, and it's something that our working group talked about, is there is already significant movement happening in the electricity sector in particular as we look to embrace more renewable energy.
Thanks, Dan. As Dan's indicated, and some of the charts from the buildings and transportation work groups as well, Maine's starting in a pretty good place already, and we stand to have even greater opportunity going forward by pursuing a clean energy economy, because growing those clean energy resources and technologies affects our entire economy. First out of the gate, and perhaps most obvious, is job creation. That's well documented, and I'll show you a graph in a minute. In the country, there's more than 3 times the amount of clean energy jobs now operating than there are in the fossil side of the economy. And enlisting and boosting Maine's can-do spirit, as was also mentioned by the earlier work groups, will help drive solutions that will further that process in Maine to its economic benefit. Perhaps most important, which they also alluded to, but perhaps didn't make as crystal clear, is that we don't have the ability to generate our own oil to use home heating oil in our economy. We do have the ability to generate our own electricity to heat homes with heat pumps. So keeping our energy dollars at home is a way of keeping that money working in Maine's economy instead of sending it off to other states. It won't be all a bed of roses. Many people in the fossil fuel industry now may find their jobs at risk. So we have to work on a just transition. And then there are the equity issues that were well put forward by the buildings and transportation groups that we also need to address and offer assistance to. This is global renewable energy deployment, and you can see how rapidly it has grown over the last 6 years, up 51%. And the news is actually better than that, is that the wage rates of those jobs are also well above US averages. Clean energy production jobs are about almost 20% higher than the US average wage. So there's a nice oasis here to get to, and that's what our recommendations and those of our colleague working groups are for. We did several level setting presentations from the ISO New England regional grid. We also had a presentation by Dr. Richard Silkman on a possible pathway to a lower zero economy power sector in Maine. We also had a presentation by Advanced Energy Economy about a number of new technologies, opportunities that could be applied in Maine. In addition, we heard from the gas folks, both describing the New England natural gas system and also from the National Renewable Energy Lab about what might be done in producing gas from renewable energy as well going into the future. And then finally, we also talked about biomass, wood energy, and CHP, as has also been mentioned. That occurred in 10 meetings of the Energy Working Group, and many of those meetings were half-day or nearly full-day meetings, a real dedication on the part of the work group members, and smaller group efforts to develop the specific recommendations also numbered at 10 or more efforts as well. We were pleased and blessed to have several members of the public attend all of our in-person meetings and I think also all of our subsequent Zoom meetings. So that was a very active contingent, and we appreciate the input from those members of the public. Our own working group, of course, represented a broad array of energy knowledge across the state and contributed throughout the process. And then finally, we also had public input from other sources as well that kind of came in over the transom, but Cassie and Sarah made sure that that got to the Energy Working Group. So it was quite a process, and just express Dan and my gratitude to you all, the 30 people involved there. And not listed here is Melissa Winnie, who has staffed us so capably throughout. This group came up with 54 straw proposals to start with, and it took some effort to consolidate and winnow them down to the 5 that you have today that Dan will describe now.
Thanks, Ken. So there are 5 overarching recommendations that we are going to run through. As Ken mentioned, the theme that I think Ken and I want to highlight through all this, which has come up today, is the opportunity for all of these initiatives to consider and prioritize equity, workforce and just transition, embracing innovation, and advancing the clean energy economy. Clearly, it's been a theme throughout the morning, and I think our group felt like Those were themes that would come throughout this. So our 5 recommendations are as follows, and we'll run through them, but is ensuring that as Maine has its ambitious RPS goal, that we have policies in place that ensure that we can meet that in an affordable manner. To initiate a power sector transformation process to run through some of the more detailed and necessary issues that modernizing our energy system requires. Encouraging combined heat and power, instituting a renewable fuel standard, and developing additional financing options to help meet our ambitious clean energy targets. So the first recommendation is about meeting our ambitious renewable portfolio standards. So again, our RPS is 80% by 2030 and a goal of 100% by 2050. Embedded within that is a long-term contract opportunity. It's actually Maine's largest clean energy procurement that's ever been done, is currently moving forward right now through the summer that the Public Utilities Commission is running. There's another procurement slated to run after that by at least January of next year. And our group felt that it was important to ensure that future sources could be brought on and that there was a signal to the development community that the Maine's market would continue to grow, that there be additional procurements put in place, particularly another one by 2022. My office is slated to conduct a study over the remainder of the year that will help inform this, but we felt like 2022 could also benefit from additional procurement. We felt that targets should be developed for offshore wind, distributed energy resources, and new technologies like energy storage. There was a energy storage commission conducted by the legislature, which had some very strong recommendations that our group considered. And then just a note on offshore wind is that the map you see there on the bottom right is the wind speed resource map for the United States. And you can see that Maine has one of the best wind speed resources in the country. So there's a significant opportunity for offshore wind. But I think that dovetails into the third bullet here, is that any renewable energy development has to give thoughtful and careful consideration to the siting and that process, and that there needs to be a full public engagement process with that. And so we felt like it was important to ensure that Maine DEP has the staffing funds that it needs to ensure that process can be thorough and timely, but that also that there should be, especially with offshore wind, early engagement to seek to minimize impacts on existing users and the environment.
Our second recommended strategy was to initiate a power sector transformation stakeholder process. Those of you who carefully observed the buildings and transportation presentations are surely noting by now that the use of electricity in those sectors is dramatically up, indeed, perhaps even dependent on electricity. And in order to accomplish that, then we're going to need a whole lot more power. Specifically how much, though, is a big question, because the entire power sector is up in the air right now. The grid as a whole can already carry twice as much power as we use if we used it more intelligently, but we may need 3 or 4 times as much power depending on how we implement. So the question isn't just how big we need to build our future grid, because building is expensive, but how we approach it. Will we use more DERs that don't get paid for by utility ratepayers, but are paid for by homeowners and businesses, for example? And what sort of rates will encourage what sort of behaviors in terms of the timing of the use of the grid, which is a big issue. You know, in short, for 100 years, we've managed the supply of electricity to users to match their demand at any given moment. And now going forward, we'll have renewable energy available and storage opportunities. So we'll have to manage the demand of electricity more to meet when those renewables are available and what storage resources we have to help supply them. So that's what this recommendation seeks to address. I mentioned that almost everything is up in the air in the blue box. We suggest that we look at the utility business model, how utilities are structured, the load management side, how can we be more flexible with how the grid is managed, and the demand side particularly. That's going to require a lot of data and information, including widespread to some new parties that are not used to it. Many non-wires alternatives, like non-generation alternatives, will also exist through greater efficiency and through distributed energy resources. How the costs for what we do end up building get allocated is another critical issue related to the equity concerns that were mentioned earlier. And as Dan mentioned, we don't exist in a vacuum. We're part of a regional grid that has both blessings and curses. Blessings are in costs and reliability. Curses are in the ability to go our own way anytime we want, however we want, because we're part of this larger whole. So at the end of the day, what changes in regulation and law may be necessary? So this power sector transformation process, closely related to the last recommendation of the buildings group, would target the transformation of and planning for Maine's electric sector to achieve a clean energy economy and Maine's greenhouse gas reductions. Obviously, there's no direct carbon reductions associated with such a process, but it's essential to ensure that beneficial electrification for the buildings and transportation can be implemented and climate goals can be achieved in the most effective and efficient ways and at least cost. Thanks. Dan, back to you for number 3.
Strategy number 3 is around encouraging the utilization of combined heat and power, and particularly using similar long-term contracting mechanisms to increase utilization of CHP. This was talked about in the buildings group. Combined heat and power is a type of distributed generation resource that is co-located next to a user. So this CHP produces both electricity and then useful thermal heat at the same time. And so there's an opportunity here to increase the amount of CHP that is developed in the state, and again reducing energy waste and potential energy costs that come with new development, or would come with these less efficient resources. Strategy number 4, again, is to institute a renewable fuel standard, which would again be the required percentage of renewable fuels that come from a lower carbon resource. The group is not necessarily comfortable with setting the specific parameters of how this would be structured, but thought that there should be a stakeholder group to determine the categories, the tiers, initial percentages, and then also felt like it was an opportunity to create pilot programs to look at potential of both renewable natural gas, but also power to gas, creating hydrogen using potentially excess renewable energy. So this was a strategy that we felt like had promise, but we felt like there needed to be some of the details worked out through additional work. Now I'll pass it over to Ken for the last strategy.
Thank you, Dan. And on this one, this is going to take some money, of course. Transportation raised that point clearly as well. So one of our strategies is then to develop and implement new financing options to meet our new clean energy economy and emission targets. The work group determined that there were a couple of options that we had that could be implemented relatively quickly. There were good precedents in other states and whatnot. And then there were some that needed some substantial additional investigation and study. So in that first category was the idea of a state green bank for Maine, and to increase revenue bonding, not only for the state, but also enable greater use of revenue bonding on the part of municipalities for pursuit of their own more local emission reduction goals. The green bank is described there in the blue box, but basically is a financing mechanism to help communities transition from fossil fuels. Both of those would require initial capitalization. There'd be challenges in that, but we've been there and done that kind of thing before, and many states have done both of these measures as well. So it's certainly not unbroken pathway. The other 3 options that we identified had a greater need for further investigation. And one of those was the consumer ownership and control of Maine's power delivery system. As many of you know, public money is typically available far more cheaply than money on financial markets to private borrowers. So we might be able to save substantial money if we used consumer-owned public monies as opposed to private money the way we do it now in building this new grid. And as a closely related part of that, some states also have a power authority, which is a semi-independent entity, which would serve as the primary energy planning and financing authority in the state. So we thought that was worth looking into as well. And then finally, we already have carbon pricing in the electric power system, and we should investigate how we could apply that to other raw energy resources, other fuels, and so forth, move that beyond just the electric power sector. However, we don't know that would be a good move for Maine on a single state basis. So we would suggest that that investigation focus on either a multi-state or a national approach and what we could do to move in that direction or be ready for it when it happens. Those are our 5 recommendations, and I think Dan and I and all of the members of the work group look forward to working with the council, helping however we can going forward this summer to flesh out the council's overall plans to recommend to the governor and legislature. Thanks very much.